the regulatory environment, compliance, and innovation in finance and banking. Our moderator is Dr. Nishal Khusial, Executive Director at Imperium Advisory Solutions. He's also a speaker tomorrow, so I'm really excited to learn from him tomorrow. And let me tell you a little bit more about our moderator. He has a distinguished career as a CEO, CTO, and IT leader in multiple corporates, including the Big Four auditor firms. And he holds a PhD in digital science, data, and technology. So I would love to invite our moderator, and he will then invite the rest of the panel and introduce each one of them. So let's just give a round of applause, Dr. Khusial.
You can actually talk nonsense.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, ladies and gents, boys and girls, and I guess everything in between to be socially correct. We are also getting to artificial intelligences in the crowd. So let me just start by, first and foremost, directing your attention to what's going to be on the screen. If we can move. So guys, I'm not sure how many of you have used Mentimeter before. Everyone's familiar with it, right? So this is more a collection of information and opinionation. I want to get the audience's collective attention and the collective consciousness of what we think regarding this up-and-coming topic. So I will start this process, and then I will invite all of our panel members to the front to sit down to be interrogated. First and foremost, you would be able to see on the prior screen. Great. From here, good ladies and gents, please access the number that you see up on the screen. I would assume that everyone over here has connectivity. For those of you who don't have a cell phone, please put your hands up. I would assume that what you see on the screen is a replica of what you see on your individual phones. Confirmation? Great. Moving to the next slide. This is, like I said, an attempt to quickly gauge the collective consciousness of our entire audience. For those of you who would prefer a QR code, the QR code is up. I'm going to browse to the set of questions, and I'm assuming, just to confirm, that we all have this screen on our phones right now. Great. Ladies and gents, what is a word or short phrase that comes to your mind when we say compliance innovation within banking and finance? You would see that there's a small segment for 3 individual responses. Pain. Well, we're off to a great start, ladies and gents. Contradiction. And what we're going to do is that we're going to leave what you see on the screen right now to collect that sort of audience consciousness, and I'm going to go into inviting the panelists. What I like is that as we are talking, we are coming to a spot where this is indeed one of the more complicated and interesting thought clouds that I've seen. For the distinguished panelist members, I have the opportunity and the privilege of, number one, inviting the first panel member, Ms. Sandy Rheeder. Sandy Rheeder holds the position of Chief Information Officer at Mukuru. She's recognized for her leadership in driving technological innovation within Mukuru and is a prominent fintech specialist specializing in remittances and financial services. Her work has significantly enhanced Mukuru's digital infrastructure, improving service delivery and consumer experience. Welcome.
Thank you.
The next panelist member. Oh, thank you, ladies and gents. Our next panelist member, Mr. Maxwell Dodd. Maxwell Dodd is the Chief Executive Officer at Orange Money Liberia. His proven track record in steering the company's operation and expansion strategies. Just to confirm, Mr. Maxwell, I see. It would seem that the trip from Liberia to the FinTech Summit is slightly delayed, ladies and gents. So we'll give Mr. Dodd a little bit more time. Let's move on to the next panelist member, Mr. Oscar Stark. Wonderful surname. Oscar Stark serves as the Chief Strategic Enterprise Architect at Liberty Group Africa. He's known for his enterprising nature in architecture and innovative solutions that enhance efficiency and customer experience. Stark's strategic vision has been pivotal in driving Liberty in digital transformation. Round of applause. Our next panelist member, Ms. Jeannine Naudé-Viljoen. Ms. Jeannine holds the position of Vice President and General Counsel at TransUnion, brings extensive legal expertise and leadership in overseeing affairs across TransUnion's operations in Africa. Through her oversight, TransUnion has contributed robust compliance and legal frameworks, and it's ensuring safeguarding interests in a dynamic regulatory environment. Round of applause, people. Certainly not least, and certainly not last, Mr. Samukele Mkhize. Samukele, or Sam, serves as the country compliance head and money laundering reporting officer for Binance in South Africa. He plays a crucial role in ensuring regulatory compliance and risk management within the crypto exchange sector. So for all of you people who have invested in crypto, be it positive or negative experience-wise, here's the individual to blame. Mkhize's efforts has been vital in establishing Binance's credibility and trust in the South African and greater market. Ladies and gents, round of applause for the panelists. Great. First and foremost, I just wanted to confirm, I would assume we don't have any substitutions, good organizers? We're good. Great. So, panelists, welcome. You would also see, given the thought cloud and collective consciousness of our audience, where the pivotal pain points lie. Red tape governance, complexity, and regulation seems to be the highlight watchwords that we see. But let's go into some practicality. The nature of this panel, ladies and gents, boys and girls and everything in between, is going to be that we will pose questions to our panelists. We will invite answers. We will also have an opportunity to round robin with the audience for your questions. So let's just jump straight into it. Thank you for the collective consciousness. I see that things are going quite nicely from an expectation point of view. So moving on to the questions. The first question we have, and this is a more conversational topic, where I think we should firstly talk about the regulatory changes itself in the financial sector over the past 5 years. So good people, let's contextualize what we are here about and what we are doing in the sense of where we've come from. So in the past 5 years, there's been a few changes from a regulation point of view within fintech and in the financial sector, which influences fintech. But specifically, I want to know, over the past 5 years, how have they impacted innovation? I've noticed that all of us here believe that there might be an antagonism, a contradiction between regulation as well as innovation. Maybe some of us feel that regulation stifles innovation. Maybe it enables it. But I will leave that to our esteemed panelists. And the first person I would direct this to is good esteemed Sandy. Can you discuss the major regulatory changes in the digital payment sector and their impact on innovation in your experience?
Sure. So I think, we'll talk about the last 5 years, but also looking further back, I mean, the change in terms of licensing provision for adlers in sort of 2015 and what that meant over time, I think even in the last 5 years, has opened up the market to more financial players, certainly in the South African context. And what we're seeing coming out of the banking sector more recently in places like Malawi, in places like Botswana, opening up e-money legislation, for example, that just opens up the market to more players. And I think in the context of innovation, that's hugely important, because the more financial institutions, fintechs can play in the market, the more they have regulatory frameworks under which to operate, the more competition you get, and I really think that fuels innovation. So I think it's quite exciting. From a South African perspective, in the last 5 years, certainly from our perspective, the Payments Vision 2025 has really defined what's going on in terms of the regulation that we're looking at. Some big changes that I think help to drive innovation is the adoption of the risk-based approach. That legislation was passed sort of 2017, but I think it's taken a while for the market to adopt that. And seeing that come through has certainly allowed KYC onboarding from a product-based perspective, which is game-changing if you're a fintech. And then we're quite excited about what's going on in the TCIP space. I think the ability for adlers and fintechs to join, being part of the clearing mechanisms there is exciting. They're talking about settlements. I think the challenge, certainly from our perspective, at Mukuru, is that a lot of the cost sits in the cash first mile and last mile and not in the middle mile, and so that cost model needs work for it to be useful. And then, less exciting is we were really hoping that NPS 2025 would bring e-money legislation into the South African framework for fintechs to start to participate, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen, so that's a challenge.
Brilliant. Good people, some pearls of wisdom here. Consider, we spoke about competition. And the nature of our observation that we've seen over the past 5 years is that there's been a distinctive move around almost incubative addition of competition within the space. I like the notion that we say that competition fuels innovation. And most certainly you need to be innovative, or if you need to be competitive to maintain innovation. So there's a supplementation there. You mentioned something quite interesting as well, Sandy, around the profiling of payments 2025, a strategic plan perhaps?
Yeah.
Excellent. So, first mile and last mile, the observation that you made there was that is the stress point so far as the monetization mechanisms are concerned within payment landscape. Great. Ladies and gents, absorbing these kind of notions will be able to inform you a little bit better about what exactly does it mean to operate within the fintech environment. How many of you have used Mukuru here? Interesting. How many of you have used a cross-border payment system other than Mukuru? And what was a random notion? Anyone in the audience? Efficient? Great. It would seem the strategy is working. Good Sandy. Excellent, good people. So, let me ask and open this question up to the entire panel. In any one of your opinions, other than Sandy, of course, how have these changes influenced mobile money services in developing nations?
Yeah, thanks. I think I'll cover it, Doc. So I think what it's obviously done is it's obviously revolutionized what you've seen in the payments industry is that you've got various iterations, and of course in my industry we've obviously developed leveraged particularly on blockchain technology and the use of distributed ledger technology. Now, what the regulatory changes do, I think they open up the market quite expansively in a market which traditionally would have been sat primarily with the banking industry. What you've now seen is more expansion expansion to your non-bank financial services providers. And of course, the most important thing is, we ultimately look to pragmatic regulation, and I think that's what we're really trying to drive in the payments industry. And I think entities like Mukuru and then Binance, obviously more in the crypto space, are really trying to drive that through collaboration with regulators in that regard.
Excellent. So there's a strategic notion and intention for us to couple ourselves with the regulators in order to ensure that the path and the journey that we traverse is not going to be an isolationary, focused regulation journey. They need to understand the actual journey that we find ourselves in, both as the providers of fintech as well as the innovators within the fintech space itself. What do you think will happen if there isn't a distinct understanding of the fintech journey in the sense of conceptualization, and regulation just is instated based on your traditional banking landscape in relation to fintech? Any one of the panelists?
I'll happily jump in there. Yes. Live that experience firsthand. The reality is that there's friction. Friction to the extent that good intentions actually die. And so the call it symbiotic relationship between regulators, fintechs, financial institutions actually cultivates a bit of an ecosystem that enables the kind of innovative growth that everyone's hunger for. But in absence of that, you're not going anywhere in a hurry.
Excellent. Thank you for that good start. Let's move on to another question. But before we do, I'm going to acknowledge that the thought provocation that we initially looked at as 110 responses, people, and of the 110 responses, we still believe red tape and governance necessary, or rather governance is necessary, and I would assume that red tape means there's too much of bureaucracy right now in essence of how we actually take to market, which enforces everyone's point here in the sense of working together with the regulator. Brilliant. Enablement, I guess that's a good notion for sure. Let's move to the second question. How does compliance with regulations foster, or how does compliance with regulation in any organization foster or hinder innovation within the financial space? I think, Sam, I'm interested to hear what you have to say given the dynamics around crypto.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I think we've obviously come a long journey in South Africa in ultimately recognizing crypto assets. I think you start off when you had that cautionary statement in 2014 from National Treasury, the SARB, and the then FSB, specifically pertaining to a lack of regulation, which ultimately meant that there was obviously a lot more risk to consumers. What we then saw was the development of that intergovernmental fintech working group, which ultimately then also was the forerunner for the intergovernmental crypto working group, which ultimately developed the crypto asset working paper. And the purpose of that paper was obviously specifically to deal with ultimately enabling regulation, but then at the same time not giving rise to untrammeled risk. Not ensuring that you don't create an environment where you have your illicit actors who are able to almost take advantage of and penetrate the system, but at the same time, you don't stifle innovation. I think that's always been almost the philosophy behind creating these regulatory sandboxes, which I'm sure all of us have participated in. Now, post that, what we've seen in the crypto asset services industry is that I think with the regulations, I think especially pursuant to, we obviously now have crypto assets being declared as a financial product. It's ultimately legitimized the industry. I think you've moved away. I think probably for the past decade, everyone probably thought crypto assets were synonymous with scams. Nowadays, I think we're seeing more take up. I think the recent crypto market study by the FSCA showed that you've got about 9.5% of the South African population, which hold of people who hold a crypto asset. Now that's a very large number, considering our socio-economic situation as well.
Sorry, Sam, the number again?
9.5%.
9.5% of our population itself has crypto.
Holds a crypto asset in one form or another. Now, that ultimately means, and that number is expected to reach about 43% by 2030, meaning that you're dealing with a product which you have to regulate. But at the same time, we ultimately And I think it's probably, our philosophy and compliance culture has always been that compliance is a competitive advantage. Because what it enables you to do is that as soon as you use the regulation to ultimately fortify your processes, you're using AI to, as part of your onboarding journey, you ultimately root out issues pertaining to terrorist financing, money laundering, and ensuring that your systems aren't vulnerable to penetration. And that's really here where, innovation, regulation rather, is essential to innovation, because it ultimately creates the legitimacy you need to ensure that you're able to take it to market and have that have the uptake, and ultimately drive. I think the previous speaker made very important focus on financial inclusion, which is ultimately what we're about. We're about the freedom of money and expanding our offering as widely as possible.
Thank you, Sam. Financial inclusion, the concept of open banking, the concept of inclusivity, the concepts of, even as it relates to banking the unbanked, I think we all are quite affair with those watchwords as experts within the industry. What I like is that we have an intention now, and we have an impetus to move in a certain direction, because things are evolving. Things will reach a point where, due to natural human evolution and propensity towards personalization, propensity towards what people value, I see that there's a lot of opportunity. The whole notion of crypto, the whole notion of financial assets. Thanks for that, Sam. Let me divert over to our good Jeannine. And this is a segue from the first question. In your opinion, how does an organization balance compliance with data protection regulation?
So I think that is a question that many of us try and solve, and I don't think it's something that anyone has solved in its completeness. There's a lot of elements to this, and some of the speakers have touched on this. I think in my mind, first and foremost, regulation creates this framework of trust. And we've seen in our business particularly how the role of compliance has changed from, and we sort of have this thing that we say in our business that a no needs to become a maybe and a maybe needs to become a yes. But you need to always balance that with what the guardrails are in terms of mitigating your risk. And for us specifically, we're a regulated licensed entity, like many of you in the room maybe, which means that you always have this counterbalance of having to comply with regulation to maintain your license. But at the same time, regulation is the absolute leveler in terms of competition. It creates a standardization, and it creates opportunity for you to almost embrace the regulation to your advantage and to become more competitive, I think, to your point. But the Counsel, we're talking a lot about payments and those concepts, but I think for a lot of us, it's actually about the data. Because all of these elements that we talk about is linked to a consumer's persona. Jay spoke about it earlier, some of the other speakers touched on it. And without data, it's very hard to navigate where you want to go to or how you want to tailor your offering. And the minute you start talking about data, you automatically venture into this field of consumer protection. And I think the consumers become much more empowered around and educated around their data, what their data is used for. And it's interesting because with the emergence of privacy regulation, you see that suddenly there's this notion by consumers sort of saying, well, you know what, you can't do this with my data, you can't do that with my data, you can't process my data in a certain way. Yet, on your cell phone, you give your data to everybody. You click, 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 you accept the terms and conditions, you update your apps. So I think there's always this interesting dynamic between compliance and data privacy. And then I think as we get into discussions with the regulators, we start venturing into this field of cross-border data transfer and how we start leveraging technology to actually drive some of these innovations and where that data is actually hosted. So I think that's a long-winded answer to a short question, but something that we can talk about at length.
Brilliant. So, good people of the audience, there's a lot of pearls of wisdom we can extract from this. Please take note that when we are talking about regulation, there is an intention for regulation. Let me ask first and foremost, 2 questions of the audience. Give me a show of hands for those of you who read the terms and conditions before clicking accept? We have a few self-righteous people here. Right. All right. So I think we have to acknowledge something here. And that is, there's an element of incubated intention around the terms and conditions, which is quite intriguing. It could be the confirmation of disclosure. It could be even consumer protection, part of the terms and conditions. I'm not going to go into a school narrative about you should read the terms and conditions. But when you have an opportunity, browse through it. There is a lot of interesting elements as well as concessions we make as consumers. We are sometimes challenging the status quo when we've already consented. Well, that's quite interesting. Being aware and being in a position of knowledge is better than the alternative and the counterintuitive. How many of you, audience members, believe that regulation itself is a bit of a stifler and we would be better off without it? That's a bit of a leading question, isn't it? It's kind of obvious. So, ladies and gents, I hold in my hand something that speaks to what our good panel members were alluding to. We spoke somewhat about cybersecurity. We spoke somewhat about the data protection. This is a device that allows interception of information. Now, it speaks to a very interesting cybersecurity notion as well. The device works remotely, interception of cellular information, Wi-Fi information, RF information, even remote information from your multiplex cars. Do you believe that's regulated? The consequence of unregulated environments opens up innovation in the incorrect sense. And it's understandable that with regulation, and I believe we have consensus here, which is great, but with regulation, we have an ability to direct the intention of innovation, to direct the efforts and energy and investment in the right manner. So an acknowledgement between whatever we are saying and you as good esteemed audience members, I will now have to tick off that apparently we don't have any criminal masterminds within this audience itself. So great stuff. Moving on to the next question, ladies and gents. In what ways can financial institutions balance regulatory compliance with the need to innovate and remain competitive? Good Oscar, I'd like to pose this question to you.
Yeah, thanks. So, financial institutions have got a specific view around regulation and what it actually means to their organization. The risk that they're running is to try and apply the same view when it comes to engaging with, for instance, fintechs. And there's an onus on the financial institutions to actually start appreciating how do they make the engagement for fintech easy through simplifying what's required to ensure that there's a trust relationship of engagement. Now, this takes on different shapes and forms, from something as simple as a procurement process, where your procurement process has been designed to ensure that whoever you're engaging with, you have a 6-month rigorous process that is either going to kill that relationship or give you surety that there's high trust. That doesn't work so well for fintechs. Typically startup organizations, time's money. So if I can't get through your hurdles from a procurement perspective in 2 weeks, we're probably not going to do business. So having a financial institution actually think through what is sensible for supporting the nature of engagement and then instigating that in a way to allow that interaction is critical.
Thank you for that. Good people. It speaks to one of our highlights in the collective consciousness, red tape, bureaucracy. There's a natural inclination in human behavior that if it's too bureaucratic, there's too much of red tape, we'd rather not. So I like the notion that innovation could simplify the path towards financial inclusion. Well said. Let's move on to the second part of the question, which I will pose to good Sandy. can you discuss the major regulatory changes in the digital payment sector and contextualize it with their impact to innovation?
Yeah, so I think this, a lot of people have spoken about it, the balance of, do you innovate first, take it to a regulator, ask for some controls around that? Do you kind of get regulation that drives innovation? And I think it's sometimes both. So the ability to play in a sandbox environment is just so powerful. And the ability to create relationships with your regulators so that you can do that, I think is hugely powerful. So, from our perspective, particularly around, you spoke about procurement from a fintech perspective, talking to a financial institution, we're talking about onboarding for an unbanked or unserved, financially excluded individual who's trying to join the financial sector and be included. How do you lower those barriers to entry? How do you lower those barriers to play? And so any legislation that opens the doors for that and allows you to take product and risk-based kind of inclusion perspectives is hugely powerful. And so I think there's a lot going on in that space. I think also, in South Africa, we don't only have to look to Europe and America to kind of look at legislation. We have some amazing innovation coming out of the African continent. And quite from a fintech perspective, some of that legislation is way ahead in terms of the ability to play with, in the clearing spaces, in the settlement spaces without being a bank. And I think South Africa is behind in that space. And the PAFI report talks to the fact that we need less dominance of the big four and more kind of financial players to come into the market to really move our innovation and financial inclusion journey along. And some countries have got that right. In other spaces, we're seeing that the data legislation, data residency, for example, as a fintech who wants to start expanding cross-border, there's conflict in data residency legislation and payments legislation in certain countries that needs to be addressed. And if you are a fintech player and you want to be a platform business, you need to be hosting in the cloud. You're kind of walking into a wall there if you kind of can't do that because of data residency laws in local countries. So I think the whole thing is a balancing act, and continuing to engage with your regulators to move the agenda forwards is the right answer.
Brilliant. Good people. There's some interesting concepts which came out of this. We segued into the platform economy. And so far as the platform economy is concerned, we're talking about unilateral, universal engagement. And we're talking about innovation which can enable that universal, unilateral engagement. But in addition to that engagement, we're also talking about the reality of where we find ourselves in the first world context, in the third world context. And as such, all of that does influence where the regulation should go to, where the concept of inclusivity and inclusion goes into. You'd notice that a lot of our speakers spoke about financial inclusion. That is our reality so far as a third world context, third world, in inverted commas, of course, good people. That's our reality so far as our third world context is an aspiration of the adoption of first world technology within this context. There has to be a middle, a sort of a transitionary panel that we have to engineer through regulation, through innovation, which allows that transition to happen. Excellent. Let's move on to our next question. I do believe we are leading towards the conclusion. So before I pose this question, I'd like to throw it out to the audience. Given the collective consciousness, given what you've heard, the pearls of wisdom, is there any specific question, and I'll accept 2 questions before going to the finalized question from the audience, that you would like to pose? I'm impressed, so, oh, yes.
Trying to phrase it as succinctly as possible, but I'd ask, where does the panelists in their view, right, your guys' expertise, your experience, think that spaces such as the FinTech Summit Africa, where do you think, or do you think that there's space for us to engage with regulators? Because I look around the room and it's a bit disappointing that there aren't any regulators that attended FinTech Summit Africa, and I mean, we're talking about FinTech. So I just want to understand, like, do you think it's something that we're not doing, or is it something perhaps that the regulators could do better? And I'll say this, I'm ex-SARB as well, before I joined Binance, so I'm quite curious to see where the responsibility actually lies, because it seems like one party says one thing, another party says another thing, so just if we can think about that question. Might not have an answer, but yeah.
I like that. Essentially, we are also determining and we are conceptualizing what is the value proposition that our collective consciousness can contribute. We really need some visibility, acknowledged, and I think from a regulatory point of view, caucusing in isolation is not the most effective mechanism. Any sort of exploratory thoughts with that regards, good panelists? Yes, of course.
So it's very interesting that you asked that question, because it's something that we've been talking about a lot. And I've recently come back. We spent some time in Rwanda with the Central Bank of Rwanda, and then I spent some time with the Central Bank of Brazil last week as well. And when you look at how we do things in South Africa, and my lens is very different to the lens of the other people sitting in the front row here. But in my experience, we've come from a world where it's almost been a very antagonistic relationship with the regulator. Our regulators have been almost quite severe in terms of how they've regulated industry. And I think you've got isolated examples of regulators that actually recruit from private sector and bring in expertise around people who understand how the businesses operate and what some of the constraints and dynamics in a business is. But then when you look at some of the African markets, we see a much more open approach to how regulators partner with private sector companies. And I think it comes down to the fact of almost understanding what those outcomes is that you jointly want to drive. So we've spoken a lot about financial inclusion. And as a business, we've done a lot of work over the last few years driving this narrative of financial inclusion. And we've probably been having these conversations for the last 5 or 6 years, and only now does it feel like those conversations are starting to pay off. But it means that you have to do a lot of investment, not just with regulators, with industry bodies, we do work with the IFC, with the World Bank. So anyone in your market that is playing in that space, you need to be talking to. And it sometimes is a continuous conversation that doesn't almost immediately yield the results that you want to yield. But I think to the point that Sandy makes is it builds credibility for you as an industry participant, and you really want to get to the point where you are almost approached proactively to ask for your view around certain things. Now, I know in South Africa that is a slightly different dynamic. I think with where we are now from a political perspective, a lot of the decision makers in some of these bodies are also changing, which means that as industry we need to figure out whether some of those views around the direction that these sort of entities are taking will change. But that notion of public-private partnership for me is key, and it's a continuous conversation.
Absolutely.
Great. I would take it that we all agree, panelists.
Yeah.
Good question. Just as a segue from the question itself, following the actual engagement we are having here, one of the intentions is to interact with the Supreme Audit Institute of South Africa to generate some sort of dialogue. So there is a strategic intent coming out of this, and it was more an incubated thought to determine what we actually generate from this from a thought pattern and collective consciousness point of view before engagement. I'm glad to say, though, that there are definitely a lot of pearls of wisdom as well as foresight and direction which is coming from this conference in itself. So an acknowledgement regarding the question. Thanks. I'm open for a second question, good audience. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, mine first I'll phrase it with, I guess, context as to where it's coming from. From where I am at the Innovation Fund, you realize that we have innovators who are in the fintech space, but they can't penetrate the regulations that our BOB, our Bank of Botswana, has set up that side. But we have tried to come around and bring solutions whereby we would partner with companies like MasterCard, whereby they have programs that they can roll our innovators in, and then with that relationship it becomes a bit better to approach the big organizations with those limitations, your BOBs. So I guess the question that I'm going to pose is for the lady from Mukuru, from Botswana. In your view, is there any collaborations that our innovators can have with you, since you have managed to get into that space whereby even remittance to other continents is possible through your platform of Mukuru? Is there anything that I can take back home and say that, okay, fine, Mukuru has this type of platform, be it a sandbox, that you guys can come through, play in there. If everything goes well, maybe they can be your partners for now being compliant, instead of then having to go the direct route of having to engage with the big guys who are regulating us. I guess that's my question.
So possibly you and I should have a chat
Yes.
straight after this.
Thank you for that, Sandy.
but I would say just in general, it's a good strategy to understand what goes on the ground in a particular country, what the big players are in that space and how they've got their licenses, and to look for partnerships that can open doors. You know, we look to do that in all of the countries that we go into. Start with a good partnership model, and so in general, I think that's a good idea to understand your market.
Okay, no, thank you.
Great question. Thank you for that, Sandy, before I needed to intercept. I think that the notion with respect to observing competitive behavior on the basis of engagement, as well as understanding the extent of geo-agility that you might have. You guys did mention something regarding your relationship with a card service provider. That's an example of geo-agility in order to leverage and access markets that would otherwise be unaccessible. Is it against regulation? Well, certainly not. Whilst it is a creative way of doing things, it is a mechanism of engagement. So supporting that notion. Good panelists, we all agree? Yeah. Great. I'm going to move on to the final question, and I'm going to round robin the final question amongst all of the panelists. And this is a nice one, because this speaks to the intention of the future. So good audience members, the question is, what are the future trends in the regulatory landscape that could impact financial services, and how should companies prepare for these changes? I'm going to round robin from the left to the right, if you guys don't mind. Go ahead,
Excellent.
Sam.
I think most importantly, I think institutions probably need to invest heavily in regulatory advocacy. I think that's probably a recurring theme throughout this discussion, given that what you see is that I think as we innovate, the regulator or regulation gets left behind. And what you want to do is you want to leverage off your, I think previously, one participated at a BASA level, and you would have engagement between BASA and the regulators. And what you want to see is that even at a non-banking institution level, that's what we probably need to develop, because I think we're probably stronger together, if I put it that way. And I think that's when you can really have a meaningful impact on the regulation and regulatory change. Because ultimately, I think to the point, for example, one of our colleagues made from Botswana, without having your voice in the room, the danger is that once legislation and regulation is passed, it's passed. That's it, and the regulator comes in and measures you with a yardstick. And we need to change that. And the only way to change that is having a lot more proactive compliance, proactive engagements. And I think one of our co-panelists made the point, you go to the regulator with potential solutions, and you engage, you have a frank discussion and see, is this going to work? I think, and that's the important thing, and it ultimately will probably give rise to a lot more inclusion.
Brilliant.
Yeah?
I like that. We could foresee a little bit more agility, a little bit more push towards inclusion, not on the basis of just financial inclusion, but RegTech inclusion as well.
Absolutely.
Nice. Over to you, Jeannine.
Thanks. I think from my perspective, we often try and solve for things by ourselves. And I think by having broader conversations, not only in our own markets, we spoke about partnerships with people on the ground earlier. We spoke about sort of public-private collaboration, not just on the regulatory front, but just broader conversations. There's a lot of frameworks and tools and examples of things that work well. And I think having broader conversations, both within South Africa and with partners across the continent, positions us well to actually influence these conversations and also to learn from one another. You know, there's a lot of lift and shift opportunities for us that we sometimes miss because we're so internally focused on overcoming this regulatory hurdle that we're facing in our own market. And I think that just gives you the ability to almost like lift your head above the water and see some of the other options.
Great. Thank you for that. And I like the whole idea of inclusion, of collaboration. We keep on talking about how we can solve for all of these macro problems, socioeconomically, and we do it in isolation. So the step in the direction of collaboration is the most important thing. I think so far as competitive edge is concerned, collaboration is one of the most effective, competitive collaboration is one of the most effective tools when it comes to innovation. Brilliantly said. Over to you, good Oscar.
Yeah, so giving a stab to your question in terms of the trends, I think technology is probably the single biggest trend that's going to impact our lives going forward. And it's not the fact that it's here, it's the rate at which it's changing. There's an exponential undertone to how technology's ability is actually changing the paradigm in which you're competing in. And if you look at how first movers kind of embrace some of it, it then challenges the rest in the market in terms of how they approach it. To be able to counteract what the trend represents and prepare yourself to be, call it competitive fit, this mindset around collaboration, and I want to stress the point mindset around collaboration, and taking your partners on the journey with you, I think is central to one's success in the future. Quite often we talk about terms like collaboration as something where a bunch of people come together, but there's a deliberate design to how you collaborate and partner, which you need to actually foster over time, and embedding within that a mindset that actually helps the growth and understanding of what these technology implications are for organizations, I do believe is one of the critical investments that will help support your future outcome.
Brilliant. Good people. Let's talk about platform economy, as good Oscar has said. So far as platform economy is concerned, the strategic intentional incubation of those collaboration mechanisms to ensure that you have a situation of the sum of its parts is greater than the individual components. That's amazing. And we have concepts like Uberization. We have concepts like those which have an ability to create and live within a super app environment with Understand. So all of those are mechanisms and a structured infrastructure that will allow that collaboration. I like the fact that we are talking to the technological first world context, and from the middleman, the middle pane that we spoke about, and the transition from the first world, third world contextual movement, I believe that that could even create an opportunity. Because we're talking about the platform economy and the consciousness of what we have around the table so far as demographics are concerned. Leveraging one set of empowered ideology, empowered commodities to other areas and to other demographics which need it. That's great. We're using technology in an effective way, collaborative way as well. Thank you, Oscar. Over to you, Sandy.
So I think to support what Oscar just said, I think because of the incredible rapid adoption and movement in tech, there will be pressure on the regulation to catch up quite quickly. And when that happens, the floodgates can start to open in terms of competitive players. And that's, I think, a trend that businesses need to watch and be prepared for. Because the landscape will change in terms of financial services, particularly in South Africa. And so how do big financial institutions prepare for that? Because, we've seen the hotel industry turned on its head by Airbnb. Something similar could happen in any industry, and so you want to be prepared for the fact that tech is going to change. It has to change the legislative landscape. It's more likely to happen more quickly in the future, and that's the only trend we can probably be certain of, which for me is really exciting. But it'll open doors and it'll change the competitive landscape, and we'll have to be ready for that.
Thank you, Sandy. Good people, you're all invited to the ReguTech Summit, which apparently we've just conceptualized. It would seem that such a notion would be a wise notion and necessary, because our translation of understanding fintech, understanding the innovation, understanding what we have as a collective, and moving that towards shaping and assisting regulation. I think that's what we can take away from this. We have such amazing aspirations as a collective. I've heard the presentations from many a people from the morning, and I must say the notions, the incubations, the intention, it's pretty amazing. And I would like to think that so far as regulation is concerned, it is an enabler as opposed to a disabler. So most certainly acknowledged. And I'm going to throw in an interesting segue. Some of you have already in the audience had an opportunity. Open banking will be a topic. I'd like you guys to take this away as a demonstration of how regulation is trying to morph and trying to evolve. Part of the open banking forum that we were involved in, we had this strange strategic notion of determining what would happen if we cascade in all of the regulatory precepts that we've got available in South Africa right now into a consolidated LLM. And for want of a better word, we decided to ask this particular AI model, not ChatGPT, good people, but this particular AI model to frame a fintech open banking legislative document. Notwithstanding hallucinations and all of these wonderful things that come from AI, it was able to generate something of about a 80 to 82% cognitive appreciation. It's quite interesting to see how the leveraging of artificial intelligence, even within our fintech and our regutech space, is going to evolve. But I think that AI as a tool is also an enabler, so too, as we had said, of our regulation. Great topic, good people, great contributions. I'd like to thank the panel for all of the pearls of wisdom. People, please, a hand of applause. Also, thank you, audience members, for being such a great audience. This draws the end of the panel session. Appreciate your time, and I hope you can take away a lot from this interaction. Thank you, people.
Thank you.